Welcome to the tutorial on IColor ProRIP Essentials. This new program from UNINET is a ground-up rebuild of a RIP software, and it focuses on providing you with all of the functionality that you need to run your white toner transfer printer without any of the added complications that can cause damage to your printer or destroy your print quality. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to cover how to import a graphic and get a transfer out the other side, but we're also going to walk through all of the individual settings and features that are included in ProRIP Essentials so that you can be confident you're getting the most out of your machine. To follow along, you'll need to have ProRIP Essentials installed, and you're going to need to validate that before launching. The installation is fairly standard, and the user manual has some great tips if you get stuck along the way, but I'm going to walk you through the validation process because there's a couple areas where it's easier to get hung up. The first time you launch ProRIP Essentials, it's going to pop up a window here asking you to validate your software. Now, you can run it in demo mode, but that's going to print a watermark out and pretty much make all of your prints useless. So you want to click Validate Software. What's going to pop up is a software activation and validation window. Now, the serial number that you enter here is not the serial number for your printer. It's actually going to be a ProRIP Essentials specific serial number that should have been emailed over to you. What you're going to do is you're going to enter that serial number here. In order to get a validation code, you're going to have to click on the link to open the UNINET iColor validation site. It will ask you to paste your serial number and the system ID that's in the box in gray, and then once you submit that, it will output a validation code. You can then use that validation code to activate your copy of ProRIP Essentials. At that point, ProRIP Essentials should pop up for the first time, and you can follow along with the rest of this tutorial. Once your program's installed and ready to go, you should have a window just like this. To get started, we're going to click this Import Graphic button right here, and that's going to pull up this menu. Now, obviously, you can navigate anywhere under your system and pull your own graphics if you have them, but you don't need one to follow along because iColor ProRIP Essentials includes this sample files folder full of print-ready graphics that you can use. Let's go ahead and pick the Carnival iColor letter design. That's one that I'm familiar with for several years. It has a lot of really bright colors and great shapes to work with, and you'll see as soon as it pops up that it's mirrored, and that's because the toner configuration is set to overprint. That means the white is the front cartridge, and that's the last color to print as the transfer is making its way through the system. That allows us to produce two-step transfers for t-shirts, hard surface one-step transfers. All of the traditional types of printing you're going to do for apparel are going to be white overprint. Now, if you click this drop-down box, you can see CMYK, and if I select that, it's going to flip our graphic to be right reading. This is how it would look on a normal piece of paper, and this is the setting you're going to use if you want to produce letterhead or invitations or thank you greeting cards, things like that. You can also do the white underprint mode, and in a mode like this, it's still going to be right reading, but that allows you to select things like aqua clear, which is a water slide type material, clear window cling, where you're going to be printing on the front of the graphic and then sticking it to the outside of a window where people are going to read it. That's where underprint comes into play because it'll put white underneath your graphic so the full color side is visible from the front. But again, for the majority of our prints, we're going to be using the overprint configuration where the white gets laid down on top of our graphic and it's going to be mirrored. That's a very fast rundown of the overprint, underprint, and CMYK settings. One thing to remember though is whenever you change this configuration, you will have to move your cartridge configuration around. So for CMYK, you're going to replace the white cartridge with your black cartridge. For underprint, the white moves to the back of the machine. It's the first thing to print, and you put a cyan cartridge in the front. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you're messing with these settings here. And the only time you're going to do that is when you're using a specific paper that's going to correlate with that new setting. Okay, right now everything is set at default. I have the iColor 560 printer installed, and the print mode is set to two-step standard. Now that's the iColor two-step standard media. It's bright, it's vibrant, that allows the whites to really pop, and it's very durable. Now, if you're using a different type of media, let's say iColor two-step select, you want to make sure that's chosen instead. As soon as you change the media type, ProRIP Essentials does everything that needs to happen on the back end to change the color profiles, the amount of toner, the fuser settings, everything, so that as soon as you click print, it knows how to communicate with the printer and get a great result every single time. Now, for most use cases, apart from that setting, the only other setting you may touch on a regular basis is the size of the media. You want to make sure that if you're running A4 media, that you don't have letters selected. Even though they're very similarly sized, they're a little bit shorter, a little bit wider, and if you've got the wrong version selected, it can cause paper jams and all kinds of issues. Now, the resolution. In most cases, you won't want to mess with the resolution. I do have a customer that prints transfers for matchboxes, and he uses a different queue altogether together. He's using the underprint queue with aqua clear media, and in his case, he selects that 600 by 600 DPI setting because he wants to really get the best quality out of the fine details and small little logos that he puts on there. But for most t-shirt designs, 300 by 300 is perfect. Same thing with the bypass tray. If you have a media that requires a different tray, it should automatically highlight that tray for you. Otherwise, if it says bypass, just go ahead and use the bypass. The same thing goes with paper type. If you're in a situation where you're changing your media settings, so for instance, let's go from overprint to CMYK, and we've got plain paper highlight here. ProRIP Essentials comes baked in with all of the settings you need for the media type. So it knows to adjust the fuser temperature down to plain to 74 grams. So you don't have to change these settings on your own the majority of the time. ProRIP Essentials already has all of this functionality built into the software. So as soon as you change the paper type, if there needs to be an adjustment to the fuser temperature, it happens automatically. So for all intents and purposes, whenever you're running ProRIP Essentials, the vast majority of the time, the only thing you'll have to confirm is that you're in the right toner configuration and that you have the right media and size of media selected. Everything else should be okay on its own. All right, so the next feature that we're going to talk about is toner reduction, or the rasterization setting right in here. In the original version of ProRIP, this setting was on by default, and a lot of inexperienced users or users that were trying to import customer graphics ran into some pretty common issues. What would typically happen is the edges of their text may look jagged. They would complain about jagged edges, or their artwork looks soft, or there's problems in it in general. I'm going to show you what it was intended to do and then what would go wrong for these customers. Okay, so I want to give you an example of what I'm talking about here. First of all, let's go ahead and I'm going to import some custom graphics. Under art examples, I have low resolution text and I have halftones. Now this halftone one is going to be an example of a very extreme case. This type of artwork is not something you want to run on white toner because these halftone fades don't typically look very good on their own. But let's say you do have a graphic where there's smoke or a situation where the transparency rolls off and there's nothing you can do about it. Let's go ahead and click configure, and I'm going to zoom in and show you how this should work as intended if we vary the dot size based on transparency. Okay, now that the graphic's loaded, we see the preview here. Now you can see that all of the holes here, they're the same size. Regardless of the transparency falling off, the holes are all going to be the same size. Well, that's because we don't have this setting right here selected. This is going to be for regular toner reduction or rasterization. Is going to come in handy when you have a graphic where there's a big solid piece of art. For a graphic like this, the intended use case of rasterization is going to be to allow that transparency to fade off and create larger and larger holes. So what we'll do here is we're going to select vary hole size with transparency, and we're going to refresh the preview. That's what this button is right here. It takes a little bit of time to render it, so we're going to click that and we're going to take a look at the preview. Look at how it changed here. So in the middle where we've got solid red, you see the holes are very, very small, right? And they're non-existent right in here. But as we start fading towards the edge of the graphic, now the holes are getting larger. So what's happening is there's solid white toner behind anywhere that you see color. And then what we're doing is we're laying down the color toner on top of that. But these holes allow us to show more and more of the garment color, simulating transparency, even though we're using a situation where there's either all toner or no toner. That's the intended purpose of halftone rasterization. This is more like how we use it in screen printing, where we use it to simulate fades into a transparent area. So if you were to have smoke or flames or something like that, this is the option you want to use here. On the other hand, here is a situation where it would not turn out the way you intended it to. Let me go ahead and import a graphic with low resolution text. This is what people were complaining about in the past. See, we have low resolution text, a very small graphic. It was done with 72 pixels per inch, so it's already just bad on a lot of levels. Let's go ahead and take a look at it once we get it into the halftone configuration. Now, if I drag this over, look at that right there. You see how the W right there has solid right in here where we want it to, but on the edges of the text where there's transparency rolling off into nothing, there's going to have all these jagged holes that are introduced. This is how the original ProRIP would react to low resolution graphics. Now, if we were to turn this off, even though we have kind of an ugly graphic and we may end up with a halo of lighter toner here, it's not going to have those really ugly jagged edges. Instead, it's going to look something like this, where you will have a solid green and then you'll fade off either to darker or lighter toner, but it's not going to cut it off completely. It'll have solid white underneath the entire graphic. Now, if we were to turn on toner reduction, but turn off the vary hole size with transparency, this is going to do a third thing. Now, let me show you a third scenario. Let's go ahead and go back to our carnival image right here, and we're going to configure toner reduction. This specific graphic has a lot of what we call negative space. That means the area in between the shapes and the little pieces of confetti have lots of underlying fabric that are going to show through. That means there's never any area that's so unbroken that we could risk the design cracking or not wanting to stretch properly or washing out prematurely, because we've got plenty of breathability spots in here. However, sometimes a customer will bring you something like a memorial shirt, and they may have a large rectangular image of a loved one that passed away, and there's really nothing nothing you can get rid of. You can't knock out black because maybe they're on a white background, and you can't just redesign the image from the ground up so that there's negative space. So in situations where you're stuck with a big solid image, instead of having to tell the customer, well, this may not wash great, it may not stretch great, it may not feel great, it may not look great, you don't have to say anything like that. You can just say, okay, when we're working with images like this, we have to have negative space. So I have an option that I can use in this scenario to introduce negative space. That's the main intended function of toner reduction here. When we're not varying with transparency, because you can see here on the edges here are very clean. They're very clean, solid, vectorized graphic edges. So there isn't any of that unintended roll off like we had with a low resolution text. And there's no smoke or fading that we need to have a varying transparency with whole size. Instead, we're trying to reduce the amount of toner getting laid down on our imaginary solid graph. And to do that, we've just introduced any number of shapes. You can use round, line, square, diamond, elliptical. Round is perfectly fine. You can adjust the choke size so that the white is laid down a little further in, and that may make it so that you don't have any white fringing on your graphic. And the holes can be larger or smaller. It doesn't really matter. 14 is default, and that's going to work just fine. But this is going to allow you to create a transfer with any artwork that's going to look reasonably good no matter what, but it's going to stretch wonderfully. It's going to wash perfectly, and it's going to be very, very durable, all while feeling great. It's not going to feel like a sticker to the buyer. So this is a hack to use any kind of artwork and still get good results. All right, so we've covered three things. We have the issue that original ProRIP had with low resolution text, and that's where toner reduction was on by default, the vary whole size with transparency function that is, and it would create those jagged edges. By leaving this setting off, you don't have to worry about that. You can take low resolution images and they're not going to look terrible like that. The intended use for varying whole size with transparency is situations where you may have smoke or intentional transparency roll-offs like we have in this extreme example. And then the use case of toner reduction without whole size with transparency is, of course, solid graphics that we can't control the amount of negative space on, but we still need to produce it for our customers. We'll turn that on, and then we're going to introduce these halftone dots here. Now, you can make these smaller. One way to minimize the look of that is to make them smaller, and you can refresh the preview. Once you get to a certain size, though, for these halftone dots, you're going to encounter an issue where if you don't peel these perfectly, you'll have white dots left over in the holes. If it falls out of the temperature window, see how small these dots are? If while you're on the press, you're peeling your two-step transfer apart, if the conditions aren't right, then you could have a scenario where you end up with several little white dots and holes where the adhesive's stuck in between here. So something like a 14, it's almost foolproof. When you're on a 14, the size of the holes, as long as you're inside a reasonable peeling window, not a problem. But the more talented you get, the more skilled and familiar with your press and your press conditions you get, you can take those holes smaller and smaller. So let's go ahead and turn off halftone rasterization and toner reduction because we don't need it for this graphic. It's perfectly prepared. There's plenty of negative space. And let's take a look at some of the other settings that we've got over here. Now, there is a potential fix. If you were to get an image like this and it's got that partial transparency and it's just very low resolution, there's an image enhancement option here. And we can say, let's put some image enhancement in or maximum image enhancement in. And this is going to try to clean up the graphic as much as possible for those real low resolution situations to make it so that it prints out as good as it possibly can without you having to go into Photoshop and make manual adjustments. Okay, under the sizes tab, this is where you would put alternate sizes of media. All of the standard media sizes that iColor sells are going to be in here by default. ProRIP Essentials comes with all of the media sizes that you're going to encounter from their product line. So this is something where you don't really have to touch it unless you got an oddball type of traditional media that you want to add to this. In the white creation tab, you have the ability to generate a white layer. This would be useful if you were printing on a CMYK printer and you wanted to run it through for a second pass and print white on top of it. But with dedicated white toner transfer printers like the iColor 560, you have that cyan, magenta, yellow, and white already built in. So it's a single pass through the system, and using something like white layer generation is completely unnecessary, fortunately. But this area here, black pigment handling. In the original ProRIP, black pigment handling was called Knock Me Blackout, where we would remove black parts of the graphic so that the t-shirt color could show through instead, and it would save us on toner. It'd also create a better looking, better feeling graphic in the process. If we were to switch over to this, where we have black in the image right here, let's go ahead and click remove black. And then we're going to be able to adjust the black sensitivity here up and down. The lower this setting, the lighter the colors we're going to remove. So if I were to drop this setting down to 64, now this area here that we know is black is going to start removing all of the black, but it's also going to start pulling from the red and from the blue that were shaded a little bit by that black spot. And if I bring this too far down, it's just going to grab colors that aren't even black at all, not even remotely, these areas here. So let's go ahead and push this back up to 84, which is our standard setting. And in your graphics, you'll be able to see better examples of this. Let's go ahead and import another graphic that's going to show a really good example of this. We're going to go up up a level and we're gonna look for the shark. There we go, surf shark. Now this guy has black sunglasses on and he's got various dark parts in the design that we could knock out very easily here. So we can visualize how this black removal is gonna function. Let's go ahead and switch over to the artwork tab and let's go right down here to the substrate color. Now this doesn't change the actual color of what we're putting it onto, but it's gonna help us visualize this a little better. So let's change this to an off teal. All right, now our background's an off teal and you can see all of the areas of the image that are black. If we come back over to the white creation and we enable remove black, watch what happens. All of a sudden, ProRIP has automatically removed the black areas of the image. Look at that. This area right in here, this area that's his sunglasses, maybe even a little bit around his teeth, his collar line, all this is automatically removed. Let me just turn that back off. You see it's back in. All these dark areas are back in. It's going to print out. And if I turn it back on, look at that. They're gone again. So if I were to print this on a blue shirt, obviously this would look very out of place because the sunglasses are missing. All of this area that's supposed to be antiqued gold looking, that's all missing. But on a black shirt, now the shirt is forming all of those dark spaces and it looks perfect. Now, the sensitivity is another slider. It works kind of in the opposite way that you might expect. The lower this number, the more that it's going to remove, the less black area it's going to remove. You see, if I drop this down, it's going to start chiseling away at areas of the image that weren't even black. These were just dark gray areas of the image or gold, and you can see that it's starting to pull from some of these other areas of the image. So if I go the opposite direction, 84 is default, and go to 95, look, we've actually still left darker parts of the image in place. The corner of sunglasses, some of these edges here. So 84 tends to be a good sweet spot, but you can make little adjustments to get a little bit more removal where you think you may need it. See, in this case, 82, that might look a little better. His fin could be a little faded out. Now, once you found the sweet spot where you're happy with how much black you've removed, then you can move forward. If you want to take a closer look though, we can go over here to image and click zoom, and then I can hover over certain parts of my image, and I can see that the sunglasses look like they've removed all of the black parts pretty well, and it's leaving only the detailed lighter spots. Right in here though, I can see that part of his fin is starting to get removed, and that may be a little too much removal. Still though, down here that looks great. So let's go ahead and go back and unselect the zoom feature. We have to actually exit out of it right there. And let's bring this back up to 84. Okay, I still see a little bit here. What if we go to 87? Now I've got almost all of the fin, but I may have introduced too much here. So we should zoom in and take a look. The fin is left a lot more, maybe too much, not sure. But then areas down here, we're starting to leave too much dark areas. And that's not gonna look great whenever we get it in toner, because the toner is really not gonna match the color of the shirt. It's gonna be a little bit shinier as opposed to the fabric. So let's go ahead and exit out of the zoom, and let's bring it back down to 83. Yes, we've got a little bit of removal here on the fin, but that's okay because overall, I think this is the sweet spot where we've removed just enough without removing too much. That should print out just fine. All right, color and toner, you can pretty much ignore this. These are graphical adjustments that change the total amount of white coverage. Now, the white choke, this is really something you're only gonna use if you notice white fringing around your graphics and you really wanna bring that white in so that you don't have any of that white outlining. It's gonna be pretty rare with a well-registered machine, so 3 is usually plenty, but you can increase that a little bit, or if you've got really fine detail and you notice that you just don't have enough white to grab all of your color, maybe you wanna drop that down to a 2. Typically though, 3 is just fine. Same thing with the white fade, intensity, and sharpness. For the most part, the black sensitivity is going to handle the knock me black out just fine, and the white fade intensity is a setting best left on default for the most part. Let's jump over to the artwork tab. This is all the position settings for your graphic. Let's go ahead and take a look here. Let's say you bring your graphic in and it's kind of up and over to the corner like that. You can click center horizontally, and now it's going to bring it right dead center on the page. That means you've got the same amount of space on this side that you do on this side. You can also center it vertically by clicking this, and now it's going to be dead centered from top to bottom. But what if you want to rotate that graphic 90 degrees? Notice what it just did. It just resized that graphic slightly. It went from 60% down to 50% to make sure that we've got enough space on the top and bottom. But if you feel like it made the graphic too small, you can fill the platen with it, and it's going to resize the graphic up to the maximum dimension that it can. Look at that. Now in this case, it left us just a little bit of space between the sides of the graphic. We're probably looking at about 1/8 of an inch, but 1/4 inch total. That's going to be cutting it close for some graphics. I typically like to have 1/4 inch on both sides, but if you've got a graphic and you want to push it to the max, you could potentially push it to that 1/8 mark. Now the other thing is you can flip a graphic vertically. Now make sure that there's no text involved when you're doing that, because you could accidentally unmirror your graphic and not notice it. The other thing is, since it's on its side, when we click flip vertically, we're actually flipping it horizontally because it's rotated. So you can rotate through the size of the graphic, see it's resizing it and making sure there's safe margins on all sides. The other thing is you could rotate it a specific amount. So instead of 90 degrees, you could rotate it 45 degrees. These are all very specific functions. The reason you might want to do this is if you had a round graphic with a little surfboard, well, maybe you could just put it in there like that. Now, notice how there's a lot of blank space here that just got introduced by us rotating it. If you were to press this button right here, you can remove that blank space and it's going to trim all of the transparent pixels, which is going to give us more control over where we put this. Let's click that here. There we go. See, even though we rotated it, we've actually trimmed all of those extra pixels. So now I can push this graphic right up to the edge and we're not wasting any space in terms of where I can put it. Now, most of these settings, they're very straightforward. Now, constraining proportions, that's something you should leave on because if you turn constrained proportions off, then you could end up deforming your graphic. And if you turn it back on, it's now locked to that incorrect aspect ratio. And unfortunately for this version of ProRIP, there's no way to set the horizontal and vertical scale separately. It's just one unified setting. So if you were to turn this setting off and adjust your image incorrectly, the best way to get around that is to delete it and start over. The next feature we want to mess with is something called color replacement. If I were to right click on this image, I can select color replace right here from the drop down menu. Let's go ahead and click that now, and it's going to pull up a menu where I can select and replace certain colors. To get started, click add replacement, and we have an option of typing in a color value that we want, or we can select pick color from graphic, and that's going to highlight this value under cursor area here. So I can move around and I can pick certain colors. In this case, let's go ahead and pick this slightly darker teal here. As soon as I click that, it's going to pull up the menu again, and I can either replace that color with a different color from the graphic using the same eyedropper, or I can type in a color value here. In this case, I'm going to type in a color value and I'm going to assign it to something very bright and vibrant like a green. So let's look at this. Bright and vibrant green, or let's just do yellow. There's not too much of that. Select that, and now all of these areas here that were darker teal are now bright yellow. However, if we wanted to change this specific replacement code, see this is the old code and the new code, perfect yellow, and the old code was this RGB. Let's go ahead and change the tolerance. When I bring that up, what's going to happen is we're going to take colors that are further away from our chosen color. If I bring this down, only the exact color that matches within a 1% variance is going to be selected for replacement. On photographs, instead of vector graphics, this is going to make a huge difference. You may want to have more so that you grab a whole area. Now, when we're dealing with vector graphics, 1% variance means we're going to be able to pick exactly what we want and it's going to grab it all. But typically, if you're using Photoshop graphics with a little bit of rasterization or brushes or photographs, you're going to have a lot more tolerance until you get everything you want without grabbing anything you don't want. Now, let's say we also wanted to get that lighter teal area. If we keep bringing that tolerance up, eventually we're going to get to the point where we grab that lighter teal area as well. Now you can see at 35, we're actually grabbing a little bit of the edge right here that we hadn't before. Let's keep ticking that up a little bit. 36, we're probably about to grab the other color. 37, there we go. At 37, now we've grabbed the light teal portion as well as the dark teal portion. We're replacing both. Now, you don't have to just increase the tolerance to grab more of an area. You can actually just keep that where it was, let's say 15% or so, and we can change a different color. We can have multiple replacements. So I can say add replacement. I can wait for the window to pop up, and when it's here, I can pick from the graphic and I can say, okay, now I want all of my reds to turn purple. So I've selected the red from the graphic, and now I'm going to use the color picker and I'm going to say I want these to be purple. Let's go ahead and pick a purple right there. Okay. And now all of my teals are yellow and all of my reds are purple, and now we've got a completely different look. So that is job color replacement in a nutshell. You can have multiple replaced colors, you can eyedropper, or you can use the menu to select whatever color values you want, and the tolerance is going to give you a wider range of colors that you're grabbing to replace or a narrower range. You can click OK to finalize that, and then it's going to show here in the preview window, and that's color replacement in a nutshell. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about is setting up a gang sheet. So let's say you have artwork and you want to make it the size of a left chest print. Let's go ahead and take this scale down to something a little more reasonable for that, 30%. And now you see we have a 2.5 inch by 3.3 inch tall graphic. And we can just set it right here. And then when we right click it, we're going to get the menu here, and we have the option to create a gang sheet. So let's go ahead and click that button now. There's another setting menu that's going to pop up, create gang sheet. And you can pick how much horizontal and vertical separation or padding you're going to put around the graphic. Now, this is a little bit misleading because if I select 1/2 inch horizontal and vertical, it's going to give me a 1/2 inch padding on this image. And then the next copy that it creates, it will add another 1/2 inch around that one. So typically you only need around 1/4 inch between graphics. I mean, that won't leave you a whole lot of room for scissors, but that's enough to get adhesion onto whatever surface you're putting it on. So if we just set 1/4 inch on both sides, that's still going to give us a 1/2 inch all the way around, which means a dedicated 1/4 inch for each of our images. Now, whenever I click OK, it's going to run a script script that's going to create duplicate copies and fill our entire sheet as much as possible. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the most efficient use of space. That's still going to take a little bit of planning. If you have 8 inches of usable space and you're using 2.1 inches of graphic, well, then you're going to end up with some loose space over here, as opposed to if it was 2 inches and you could get 4 perfect images across the board. So let's go ahead and try this out and see what happens. Now, initially, it sometimes creates a duplicate right in here, but it's actually setting it up there and then moving it to where it finds space. So by the time it finishes, everything should have its own little location without any overlap. But here's a great example of negative space. Because the image here is 2.5 inches wide, 2.55 inches wide, we don't have enough room for both the padding and another image. So pretty much everything after the 5.5 inch mark is wasted. Now, let's try something a little different. Let's go ahead and manually plan this out. We're going to go ahead and remove these graphics, and let's try rotating this image a little bit. We're going to go clockwise 90 degrees, and then I'm hoping here that if we can set it up, we can have 2 images side by side. So let's just see what happens if we clone the graphic. Go to 1/4 inch. Now, before we had 6 images, my hope is we can get at least 8. And there we go. So now we have a much better use of space. Same location. Imagine if this was a horizontally oriented graphic where you had text going this way. We'd be able to fit 8 images in the same area that we were only able to fit 6 images just by planning our artwork a little bit better. So keep that in mind when you're creating a gang sheet, that this function will do exactly what you tell it to, but it's not going to plan the most efficient use of space. You'll have to do that on your own. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you is how to use Smart Cut. So first of all, let's go ahead and grab a new graphic, and we're going to take a look at, let's do the marlin. That's a large fish right here. It's a great image. Okay, what Smart Cut allows us to do is take an image that may be larger than any one of our transfers. So on the iColor 560, you're going to be using a lot of A4, which is 8.25 by 11 and some change. But oftentimes our clients want to see images that are 11, 12, 13 inches wide and 11, 12, 13 inches tall. That's something that we just can't fit on a single sheet of transfer paper. That's where Smart Cut comes in. It allows us to take an image, blow it up to much larger proportions, and then separate it into multiple transfers. And what it'll do is it will cut along seams where people's eyes aren't naturally going to be attracted to. Instead of just being a sharp horizontal line, it's going to follow the contours of the artwork. That way, when you put them back together, people aren't going to see where the 2 images were put together. It gives you a little bit more leeway in terms of doing your transfers. Even if it slips just a 1/16 of an inch, people probably aren't even going to notice. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look here. And down here at the bottom, you see the split image using Smart Cut option. That's going to launch a totally separate instance of Smart Cut, which is fully featured separate program. Let's click that now. Okay, so now that Smart Cut is loaded, let's go ahead and maximize this image. All right, so the first thing I want to do is point out the width and the height. This image at 200 pixels per inch is actually an 11 by 10 inch image. That's larger than our 8.5 by 11 or 8.25 by 11.6 inch transfer can handle. So let's go ahead and just take this image at full resolution and split it apart. So to do that, come on over here to this menu that says Mask and Split. Let's go ahead and click Split. Now you'll see the first and the second. You've got a pink and a blue. This is going to be the first transfer sheet and the second transfer sheet. So we're going to want to create a boundary box for the first one and the second one, and there needs to be some overlap here. So let's go ahead and bring this in. Let's maximize it, and I'll show you what we're talking about. Under the little gear icon here, if we click that, it's going to allow us to choose different dimensions. So you have A4 legal, A4. Let's just go ahead and pick A4 as our main transfer. That's going to be transfer 1. We can just leave it on auto center. Okay, now you see the left-hand side here. It has a little pink outline showing how much of this image is going to be covered by the first transfer. Now, don't worry too much about that yet, because we're going to move these around once we get our second transfer on the board. Let's go ahead and click the gear again, and we can use another A4 transfer. Now we have 2 transfers. Now look at what's happening here. The blue transfer has a lot of blank space, so does the purple transfer. Now we're shifting it so that this is the area of overlap. This is the area that Smart Cut has to work with in order to pick a spot to cut this image. Now, we don't have to leave this image vertically oriented. This area of overlap here is a little awkward, right? You've got the flow of the fish that kind of goes along this diagonal horizontal, but only this area here is what we're picking to split it apart on. In fact, it's kind of the highest activity area of the image. You've got all these waves and all of this fish. Maybe we should rotate this image 90 degrees and let it split along a more natural path, at least a less noticeable one. Let's go ahead and click that now. Now what happened here is it took our sheets with it. So if we want to rotate the orientation of our transfer sheets, let's come over here to the gear again, and we can click delete to get rid of one of our sheets, and then click OK. Now we've removed our first pink sheet, and we can do the same thing again with the blue sheet. We're going to click delete and click OK. And now we're essentially starting back over with our split because we noticed there was a little bit of an issue with how we were trying to split it apart. So let's go ahead and do it again. Let's click the gear icon. We're going to go ahead and go with an A4 sized image. click OK. Notice that it's vertical again. So let's go ahead and drag this over so that we have just the top of the fin, and now plenty of room to work with the image. Click the second one. We're going to do A4 again, and we can bring this way over. So now we have a lot of room for Smart Cut to figure out where it wants to produce this split at. Now, there are two options here, photograph and graphics. If you choose photograph, it's going to assume that the majority of the image is going to look kind of like this wave. There's no sharp lines or edges for it to contour along, so it's going to get a little bit more creative. If we split it as a graphic, it's going to look for more sharp vector lines to follow along with. Let's try graphics as our smart split. And the next thing we want to pick is what color of garment that we're going to be putting it on. In this case, let's just assume that we're going to be putting it on a black shirt. That means it's going to be more biased towards picking areas where you won't notice the line as much in the dark areas. Now, this happened very quickly, but we have the first image right here, and it's cut right along the fin. Isn't that interesting? It cut it right along the fin, where if there's a little bit of separation, it's just going to look like a thicker shadow against a black shirt. So we have that one. Okay, now we can click save over here in the bottom right. And what's going to happen is it's going to close out of Smart Cut and send both of the images that we just created back over to ProRIP. So the results will be sent for printing. The application will close on success. Proceed? Yes. Now back in ProRIP, it's going to say, is it okay to load graphic 1? Now let's go ahead and click OK here. And the first image loaded, you can see that we have the majority of the marlin and a little bit of this leftover fin right there. And it's essentially ripping that first image right there. As soon as it's done ripping that first image, now we have it up there, we can click OK to load graphic 2. Now this is what's going to be put on our second transfer. We'll click OK here. Now you can see our second transfer has a lot more of its space used, but we're able to fit an image that was larger than the dimensions of any one transfer sheet. So now that's just with an 11-inch graphic. What if we were to take this marlin, the same marlin, and try to blow it up even larger? Let's just take a look at that real quick. So let's go ahead and open the marlin back up. We can see that it's a pretty large square, but we can actually get a little bit more creative with how big we make this image. So let's go ahead and do this again. Let's split it using Smart Cut, and let's take it in here. So right now we have an 11-inch by 10-inch image. The key here is the resolution. We're actually at 200 pixels per inch, which is a pretty good print resolution. Anything over 150 is going to be acceptable. So let's just go ahead and see how large we can get it while still being over 150 pixels per inch. Let's go ahead and go up to 15 inches. Okay, well, that's about right. 150, 148.6 pixels per inch. It's going to be pretty close. It will start to degrade if you get it too much larger than that, but from a foot or two away, this is still going to look like a decent graph. Now the question is, can we actually fit this on 2 sheets of transfer paper? I'm not sure. Let's take a look at it. So let's go ahead and rotate this over like this, and let's click on split. I'm going to go ahead and do the gear here, and we're going to pick the same A4 size transfer for our first one, and it's going to put it right over here. Now look at this. Already I can see a little bit of a problem. The image is not going to fit on a single sheet of transfer paper right there, because we have the nose is just too long, even for the long side of our image. So let's go ahead and bring it down a little bit. Let's go ahead and say 12.5 inches, because we have this area here that we can kind of bring down a little bit. Does that do it for us? Yes. Okay. So now that we're down to 12.5 inches, the resolution is obviously going to get better because we've shrunk it down a little bit. But now we've focused the marlin in this area here. So we have the first part of the image. See how it sweeps over to the left. So we're kind of wasting that space. Well, now we've blown that up so that a single transfer is going to cover that area. Now we can go ahead and set our second transfer, A4 size. Now we've got our second transfer, and that's going to cover this area of the image here with the splash, with the bottom of the tail. So we can actually bring this over and say all of this area here is now viable for overlap. It doesn't have to be perfectly horizontal. We can actually stagger it a little bit. Now this time, let's go ahead and just split it as photo to see what it does a little differently this time. So we're going to click Smart Split right here, and it is still going on a dark garment, but here the split's going to be a little bit more interesting because we're not actually allowing it to start the split down here. In fact, I want to talk about that real quick. This image, you can see where we're allowing it to split. We can't really move the pink box up anymore because we are limited by the top of the fin and the pointed tip of his nose and the tip of his snout. This is going to be how far over we can get and how far down we can get. So this is it right here. That means we don't actually have the ability to do a whole lot with this part of the fish. Even if we were to move it down, that doesn't increase the usable area at all. We're still going to be limited by what can be cut apart right in here. So I'm curious to see what Smart Cut does with that. Let's go ahead and do Smart Split, treat it as a photo, and we're going to say, okay, this is a dark garment. So immediately you can see that it split it right across there. So it's a very small cut. See, it's going to go right across the back of the white part of the body, and the fin is contoured very well. So when we get this onto a shirt, that's the only area that could potentially be noticeable, but you'll be able to focus on that easily whenever you're lining up the 2 transfers, because this is going to be a very forgiving portion of the cut. Other than that, everything else is completely separate artwork. So now that it's done, let's go ahead and bring this back into ProRIP, and let's just see what this looks like when it's on individual transfers. We're going to click Save and click Yes. It's going to close down Smart Cut, and it's going to give us the option to bring it back into ProRip. Okay to load graphic 1. It's going to bring it in. It's going to rip it. You can see it's doing it right here on the top. As soon as that's done, it's going to ask us to bring in the second one. All right, now that it's ready to load graphic 2, click OK. It's going to bring it in. It's going to try to rip it for us real quick. And I want to draw your attention to what this looks like here. We've brought in an image that's very large. It's 12.5 by 14 inches. In fact, the only other way to print this would be on something like an IColor 800 that has a 12.5 inch wide print area. So now with your 560, you're able to cut apart a graphic that is as large as the flagship printer and put it onto just 2 transfers. It's actually going to cost the same amount that it would to print it on an IColor 800 because you're using two $2 transfer sheets to get the same results. It's just going to take you a little bit longer in processing and in transferring to get it done. But we've been very efficient with the amount of space we've used here. We've taken an 11-inch sheet and we've maximized both the height and the width of that sheet. I mean, we're at the very bottom of this, almost up the very top. Now, the other thing is we should center this before running it into production. Now, if I was going to process this image, I would definitely want to trim it. And we're going to do that right here. Remember, remove blank space. That's going to cut off the blank pixels on all sides. And we can bring that one tip of the snout up a little bit. It's going to give us a little bit more room to play with. Click that there. Now that it's trimmed, we can go ahead and we can center it. First, click the center horizontally. It's going to move it over just a hair and then center vertically. And now we're bringing that edge up just a little bit so that it's not right at the edge of the transfer sheet. Okay, we can come back over to the other side and we'll do the same thing here. We're going to first trim out the blank space, get rid of all the blank pixels. And here it's detecting that there's some bit of artwork in here. I can't tell based on this. We can change the platinum and see if we can spot it real quick. Let's go ahead and do like a cranberry look. Okay, yeah, I see just a little bit of splash in here. So that's not going to allow us to trim this area here, but we can still center it horizontally and vertically, and it's going to help a little bit. This is plenty of space right in here and plenty of space on both sides. So now you could take these 2 images, run them as transfers, put them back together on a shirt on press, and you've created a large all over graphic with just a couple of clicks. Very, very cool stuff. The last thing you're going to do whenever you've prepared a job and you've brought it in, whether or not you're using Smart Cut, is you're going to print it. To do that, first make sure all of your settings are correct, that you have the right paper selected, the right size selected, and that all of these settings here are either at default or you've changed them with specific guidance for a certain reason. Then whenever you're ready, you can go up to this area right here and click print to output your job on your printer. I don't have a printer hooked up now, but once it's done ripping, it's going to send it out to the printer and you'll be able to select your printer from the drop-down menu, click OK, and it will come out the other side. So you can see iColor ProRIP Essentials has all of the features that were core to the iColor ProRIP original experience without the clutter of having sliders that may or may not apply to your specific printer. This is designed from the ground up to work with the iColor series of printers, and it does a phenomenal job of presenting you with the options that you're going to use on a regular basis. Now, this tutorial is not a line-by-line deep dive onto every little feature that's included with ProRIP Essentials, but it's definitely enough to get you up and going and handling the vast majority of situations that you're going to encounter on a day-to-day production basis. If you enjoyed this tutorial, definitely dig deeper into the White Toner Masterclass. We spend hours really deep diving into the content over there. If you're on a 560, you have a copy of the White Toner Masterclass, and that's a great place to find an expanding library of content related to your printer and the industry specifically. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.